Hello and welcome to the Immaterial Podcast. I'm Chris Ekimoff, and if you work anywhere near accounting, finance, the law, or securities enforcement, you've probably heard of the concept of materiality. In short, it's what matters. The Immaterial Podcast will work to provide you with a lot of the details about what matters, but with a signature perspective as a practitioner and all-around accounting nerd. I'm a CPA, I'm certified in financial forensics, and a certified fraud examiner. And for the better part of 2 decades, I've worked in and around financial fraud investigations. Investment fraud, accounting manipulation, internal investigation, regulatory inquiries, and expert testimony and litigation support. I get called when something doesn't make sense, when the stories don't reconcile, or when the numbers technically work, but something just feels off. I'm a native Western New Yorker, go Bills, here in the good old United States of America, and have spent my career in and around Washington, D.C., the Mid-Atlantic region, the Big Apple in New York City, and some on-site project locations that you might not be interested in vacationing at. Over the years, I've worked alongside and sometimes am across the table from regulators, prosecutors, defense counsel, law enforcement, auditors, compliance professionals, and my fellow forensic accountants. And there's one thing that's always stood out to me. We all have the same facts. Most of the time, we might have the same objectives. And many times, we'll even use the same words. But we do not always argue the same points. We don't always reach the same conclusions. And with those words, we may not even mean the same things. Fraud, waste, abuse, non-compliance, materiality, intention, scienter, loss, internal controls. All of these words can carry very different meanings depending on who's using them and why. This podcast is about closing that gap. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the Immaterial Podcast owes a lot to my predecessor effort, the inSecurities podcast from the Practising Law Institute. If you haven't followed along on my journey with my co-host Kurt Wolf through the past 5 years of interviews, analysis, as well as support from the team at PLI for our securities enforcement and regulatory focused podcast, check out the show notes below for a link to that. So, what is the Immaterial Podcast? The Immaterial Podcast sits at the intersection of accounting, the law, securities regulation, law enforcement, and litigation. But we're not just focused on the headlines. Every season will include in-depth interviews or our record of consultation or ROC episodes with people who actually do the work, the securities regulators themselves, prosecutors and defense attorneys working cases that matter to our listeners, law enforcement professionals who are out investigating allegations of crime, issues with the court system, or how those cases are being perceived, and my fellow forensic accountants and expert witnesses. We are not focused on sound bites. We are not focused on talking points. We want real, open conversations about how those cases actually come together and sometimes maybe fall apart. Another one of our signature features of this podcast will be our forensic look-back episodes. In those episodes, we're going to take famous, well-known accounting fraud cases, the ones everybody knows about, but maybe nobody really understands in detail, and we're going to go line by line. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, we're going to look at the debits and the credits. We're going to look at what accounts are impacted by the behavior that's alleged or proven to be true in those cases. What journal entries hit the general ledger that reflect some of the decisions that were made at the time. Where internal controls existed and maybe didn't function effectively or were circumvented intentionally. We'll talk about the mechanics of those schemes. We'll look at example financial statements that show how a similar type of scheme may appear to show its issues on the balance sheet, the income statement, the statement of cash flows, and the statement of owner's equity. We're not just going to focus on those outcomes because fraud doesn't happen in the headlines. It happens in the spreadsheets. And then finally, our analytical procedures episodes will address recent developments and current events in the legal, accounting, and finance space, but always with a bit of context. We're not focused on summaries. We're not focused on hot takes. We're looking at questions like, what is being proposed here? What's the potential impact? And maybe almost most importantly, what's the process that must be followed before this regulation, this activity, this new accounting rule is finalized? We'll look at what does that mean for practitioners? How might this impact the daily lives of financial reporting, FP&A, or other types of accounting folks out there? And then maybe discuss some of the things about each of these developments in the news that may be misunderstood, misrepresented, or even just not fleshed out well as we're getting this information. Because sometimes that misunderstanding is just believing that something is really simple when it's not. Now, on to our style. If you are coming to the Immaterial Podcast looking for zany soundboards or exploding memes or graphics, this probably isn't for you. If you're looking for clarity, precision, and thoughtful discussion, as boring as that may sound, you're in the right place. We'll be technical when it matters, we'll slow down when it's necessary, and we'll always respect and focus on the complexity of these issues, even when the ending result might be, quote, the investigation does not substantiate these allegations, end quote. Because sometimes the most important conclusion in a case is one that nobody expects. Now, a little teaser for our next episode. We're kicking things off with really a foundational question, one that shows up in indictments, in complaints, in newspaper and press headlines, in settlement documents almost every single day. That question is, what actually is fraud? Not in theory, not in a dictionary definition, but in practice. What are we charging when someone is alleged to have conducted fraud? What types of information is being provided to a court to either prove or disprove those allegations of fraud? We're joined by a good friend of mine who's been a practicing U.S. attorney for many years. Really excited to have that episode come out to you all soon. So thanks for starting out and joining me on this venture. If you work in this space or want to understand how maybe it actually functions, I'm glad you're here with me. And we promise that although the Immaterial Podcast isn't quite authoritative, it will always be authentic. We'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in.